Open source is dead. Welcome to Startup Hack. I'm Spencer Thomason, and here at Startup Hack, we love training software developers and building custom software solutions. So I do a lot of work as a fractional CTO. With over a decade of executive leadership and a solid 25 years in software development, I've mastered the art of transforming technology teams and products. All right, let's jump into today's topic. Open source is dead. Yep, I said it. The golden age of open source software seems to be over. Once hailed as the hero of software development, it's now facing a slow, painful death. So the question is, what killed it? Well, part of the issue is that corporate interests have crept into open source worlds. So let's dive into our topic today. Alright, so what's killing open source and what's making this big change? So what was once a community-driven effort has become commercialized, with companies prioritizing profits over collaboration. One major example of this shift is how large companies use open source software without contributing back. They take from the pool of freely available code but don't give much in return. Think about this like a potluck where everyone brings food, except now most people are just showing up empty-handed. This creates an unsustainable model. Developers who pour their hearts into open source projects end up burned out, especially when they see corporations reaping the rewards without any compensation. Now, to be fair, some companies still support open source projects, but it's not what it used to be. The heart of open source community, collaboration, shared innovation, it's fading. Look at what's happened with license like HashiCorp and this controversy. Companies are changing the rules to protect their own interests, making it harder for developers to freely use and share code. The open source dream is being twisted into something unrecognizable. So another nail in the coffin is the financial sustainability of open source. Developers need to eat, right? For years, people have contributed their open source in their free time, driven by passion. But passion doesn't pay the bills. These days, many developers find themselves forced to take on corporate jobs or find other ways to monetize their work. Open source has gone from being a labor of love to a side hustle, and that's where things start to break down. So speaking of side hustles, make sure you go back and check out our old videos because we have hundreds of free coding samples absolutely for free, so go check those out. Now, we can't ignore the slow evaporation of the FOSS, or free open source software, and the surplus that's given. That surplus was a huge reason open source thrived. Developers had time, energy, and a shared belief that they were making something for the greater good. But with the tech world evolving so rapidly, developers are spread really thin. Instead of building a sustainable ecosystem, we're seeing fewer new contributors and more burnout. This decline in active participants is yet another reason that open source is gasping for air. Some are going to argue that open source is still very much alive. And sure, it's not completely dead, but it's definitely on life support. Big companies like Google, Microsoft, and Amazon say they support open source, but now if you look much deeper, much of their support is more about controlling key open source projects to serve their own interests. Open source has become less about community and more about control. A good example of this is Microsoft with Linux. For years, they despised Linux, and then they began to embrace it, and surprise, look at it, here we have Azure, which largely uses open source. So the fact that we're seeing companies pivoting away from fully open license is telling. We're opting for hybrid licenses that protect their business while offering some level of openness. It's a compromise, but it's not what open source was meant to be. This shift dilutes the open source ethos. Developers no longer feel the same sense of freedom and creativity that once came with contributing to a project. It's as if the magic is gone. Now, and let's talk about security issues. Open source once was praised for its transparency. Anyone could audit the code and fix bugs. But today, open source projects are often underfunded and understaffed. The Heartbleed vulnerability in OpenSSL showed us how dangerous it is to assume that open source projects are automatically secure. With fewer eyes on the code, vulnerabilities slip through the cracks, leading to massive security breaches. The trust in open source has been shaken. So now another challenge facing open source software is the rise of SaaS, or software as a service. Why would you download and maintain an open source tool when you can just subscribe to a managed service for a small fee? The convenience of SaaS is killing open source adoption. Most users don't care if the tool is open source as long as it works and someone else is maintaining it. This trend towards SaaS has changed the game, leaving open source behind as more of a relic than a solution for today's needs. So the death of open source also means fewer opportunities for junior developers to cut their teeth on real-world projects. In the past, contributing to open source was a way to build a portfolio and gain experience. But with corporate dominance and fewer active open source projects, these opportunities are drying up. It's a huge loss for the next generation of developers who won't have the same chance to dive into meaningful code contributions. But hey, maybe this isn't the end, and maybe I'm being a little doomed doomsday, but maybe it's a turning point. Open source might need to evolve to survive in today's landscape. We could see more companies adopting a hybrid model, offering part of their code as open source while keeping core features proprietary. It's not ideal, but it's better than letting open source die out entirely. The community may need to rethink how we approach sustainability, financial support, and corporate involvement if open source is going to thrive. And as always, I love having comments, so tell me your thoughts on this because I'd love to hear from you. It's one of the best compliments that I can get. Now, the future of open source could hinge on finding new models for collaboration and compensation. Maybe we'll see more tools like GitHub sponsors or Open Collective that allow developers to fund their work while keeping the code open. It's possible the spirit of open source will live on, but it won't look the same as it did in its heyday. Developers and companies alike will need to strike a balance between free collaboration and financial stability. So open source is fading, and the reasons are clear: corporate dominance, financial instability, and the rise of SaaS. The once thriving community-driven movement is now at the mercy of companies that prioritize profits over collaboration. While there are still efforts to keep open source alive, the cracks are definitely showing. We're seeing fewer contributions, more burnout, and a general shift towards proprietary solutions. Open source is far from the revolutionary movement it once was back in the GNU days, and it may need to evolve to survive in the modern tech world. Now, what are your thoughts? I love having a great discussion, so make sure to leave us a comment and make sure to like and subscribe. Here at Startup Hack, we love to train software developers in our coding boot camps and to build custom software solutions. So reach out because we'd love to help. Hit the links down below or check out startuphack.com today.